start off with the general introduction on this. So obviously the Equal Pay Gap 1970 was intended to remove discrimination between men and women with regards to terms and conditions of employment. Since then, we've had the Equality Act 2010, which gives women and men the right to equal pay for equal work, with women and men being legally entitled to be paid the same rate for light work rated as equivalent, or work of equal value. We've also had the gender pay gap reporting that was introduced for organisations employing over 250 people in 2017. So despite this, we still see significant disparity between men and women's pay. This month, there's been a lot of media coverage around recent results on the gender pay gap reporting, reporting that on average, women are earning 90p for every pound that men do, with some of the worst offenders paying female employees only a third or half of what they're paying their male employees. So acknowledging that gender pay remains an issue, but then overlaying the intersectionality faced by women, wherein the pay gap is compounded by disruption to earnings and their careers by maternity and then also by menopause, women are reaching pensionable age with a pension gap that means their pension pots are roughly half that of male pension pots. Pregnancy and menopause have historically been seen as women's problems to deal with within their career structures, but these issues will impact every single one of us, directly or indirectly, leaving us with a much broader question for society as a whole. How do we tackle these inequalities that mean that women start their careers with pay parity, move through life and career stages, and end up with 50% of men's pension values in retirement? We are really pleased to be joined today by a panel of experts to help us unpick these issues. We'll be welcoming Dr. Diana Keeble-Ramsey, who's Associate Professor at the University of Suffolk, and Professor Chris Lan, who's a Professor of Work and Organisation at Anglia Ruskin University. Dr. Anna Paraskev-Povlu was Senior Lecturer in HRM and Leadership at Anglia Ruskin University, was going to join us today. Unfortunately, she's ill with COVID currently, so we wish her a speedy recovery, and hopefully she'll be able to join us at another event in the future. So if we could, without further ado, we'll introduce our speakers. Hello, Dr. Diana and Professor Chris. So hello. If you could just give yourselves a brief introduction on yourselves for those that are listening.
Chris, do you want to go first to C before D?
Okay,
in the alphabet.
Thank you, Diana. So I'm Chris Land. I'm a Professor of Work and Organisation in the School of Management at Anglia Ruskin University. I've worked at several other universities in the past, including the University of Leicester, St Gallen, Warwick, Coventry and Essex. And my research area is work, what people do for a living, how that's changing, how technology is changing what people are doing in work and how they relate to it, what counts as skill. And I've done two particular recent projects that are relevant to the topic today. One has been looking at well-being and health and stress, looking particularly at emergency services workers and differences in the different services. And I've also looked at the experiences of women in the brewing industry, particularly looking at craft brewing, sort of very male-dominated traditionally industry, with women just entering into that, and how the experience of going into sort of neo-craft or new craft industries with changes to the structure of the industry has impacted on their working experiences. Diane.
Yes, so I'm Diane Keeble-Ramsey. I'm currently representing University of Suffolk this afternoon, and I really hope that you can hear a genuine Suffolk accent, because I've been alone in Suffolk for the last 2 years called a pandemic, and not quite as alone as it first sounds, but I probably almost sounded Essex before then, but fortunately I've recovered my Suffolk roots. For those of you who are watching The Detectorists as a series, you might understand the difference between the Suffolk and the Essex. And before I just suggest that Suffolk background, I'm afraid my friends in other universities will be quite upset that I don't say hello to them, because from the CMI perspective, I do a lot of work with the Open University with a chartered management degree. And so there will hopefully be somebody out there quite pleased to hear and see me in another role rather than looking at their portfolios and their endpoint assessment. I'm also tonight, later on, broadcasting on international human resource management at the University of Portsmouth, which is part of the Cambridge Education Group. So hello to those people who'll be seeing me later on, because that gives us a kind of international twist to these very big points. I also currently work for the De Montfort University, so those students there are very likely to be here, as many of them are actually CMI members. So I need to mention those universities as well. My background, well, I'm a chartered member of the Personnel and Development, so I have spent too many years, decades of years working with HR professionals in particular, talking about these topics. And in fact, the idea of the Equal Pay Act was a constant feature of our lectures, thinking about the film Dagenham, Made in Dagenham, which you might all be familiar with. I am a woman, and in that I have had children, so I've had the joy of maternity and its various guises, because I have children about every 5 years, not recently, I might add. So there's been differences that I personally experienced. I also used to be part of something called the Silver Economy Research Group at Anglia Ruskin, and further a university-wide deputy director of the Positive Aging Research Institute. And that's really interesting to us, because it gave us the relationship to aging and the issues that relate to those parts of aging. It's something that I'll come back to, because much of my research has been around these issues about gender, but also the other issues outside of age. And the international work I do at the moment also gets us to think a little bit more about how this translates around the world, because issues about culture and issues about things which are wider than the UK. So I'm given a minute, I'm sure I was over.
Thanks both. So thanks for joining us. So we've let's kick off with the first question. So the first thing we'd like to talk about is what has happened to the landscape in relation to gender pay and the pension gap, and have we seen any progress since the gender pay gap reporting was introduced in 2017? So if we start with you, Chris, first, please.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll just, I think perhaps just so everybody's clear, it's maybe worth just giving you a few facts and figures in relation to how that pay gap has changed. And I'll let Diane pick up the point about the pensions. But the pay gap since 2017, it has improved somewhat. We've moved from a pay gap of 18.4% to 15.4%. So there is some improvement over those 4 years. Although the director of the CMI, and Frank, has referred to this as rather glacial progress, that it's not moving fast enough, and it is still going to be a long time before we're realizing parity. It's also worth noting that there are quite significant differences between part-time and full-time, for example. So if we look at that, the gap between part-time workers, in fact, women earn slightly more, partly because they're overly represented. So they earn more per hour, but if they're working more in part-time, then their overall earnings are going to be reduced. And that will impact, if people are more represented in the part-time, what they're paying into the pension pot will be less, and therefore their retirement benefits from their pensions will be lower as well. I guess the other point that's worth looking at in relation to that is that we have actually made some significant progress since before then. If we go back 20 years before 2017 to 1997 and the end of the previous millennium, the pay gap was around about 27.5%, so much higher than it is. So there is a steady reduction in the pay gap. So I think that's really important to recognise. The other thing that's worth picking up, and this will be picked up when we discuss the menopause, I'm sure, and also impacts on the pensions, is that pay gap increases with age. So if we look at younger workers, sort of the 22 to 29-year-old, most of these are sort of age that people would be entering the workforce if they've got a degree or already establishing themselves post-apprenticeship if they've gone in through that route, then the pay gap is less than 1%. If we start to look at workers in their 40s and 50s, however, that increases quite significantly. So we start to see that going right up into the double digits. So it's a much larger pay gap for different people in different age groups. And what we see is that pay gap increases as people go through their age towards later on, particularly because of professional careers leading to higher salaries as they go further on through those. You tend to have different earning curves around the different sort of professions. It's also worth looking at some of the figures for the different sectors. So if we look at finance, for example, or information technology and communications industries, the pay gap there is around 22% for finance and 27% for information technology and communications. Although the largest pay gap is actually for any particular organization that's been reported was EasyJet in the most recent figures. So we've recently just seen the 2021 figures published in 22 because they're always a year later. EasyJet had a 64% pay gap, which means that for the women that they employed earned just 36 pence. This is a median statistic, so it's the average, but the average that's right in the middle. So it's not skewed by really high earners or really low earners. So that's the largest single pay gap. Now, if you think about the structure of the industry for EasyJet, the vast majority of pilots in that sector are men, and the majority of cabin crew who are less well paid are women. So you start to see there's actually two different professions that are reflecting that. So we see what we'd call a horizontal segregation in the industry. We've got two different professions paid different amounts of money that would describe, or at least explain, some of that pay gap. It is worth noting that in their defense, because there was quite a bit of publicity around this over the course of the last month, EasyJet did flag also the impact of COVID on their employees. So they had a large number of their cabin crew in particular were furloughed. Obviously, that's going to have a huge impact on people's pay and conditions. They're not going to be able to work overtime. They won't be getting the bonuses that they'll be working for the travel. They were getting a reduced income in any case. So that made a larger impact on some of their employees. If we look at the areas where the pay gap is the lowest, we'll start to see that it's in health and social work. So the care sectors, essentially, those that are traditionally associated more with women working in the industry anyway, they also have some of the lowest pay in those areas. They're not as well paid as construction industry or as IT or finance. And there the pay gap is just 2%. So women are earning still less, but just 98 pence for every pound that a man is earning. So I think it's quite significant to look at some of those variations. I think that probably gives it a broad summary viewpoint. Dan, I don't know if you wanted to add anything there or pick up any of the points
Chris,
about pensions.
that's immensely helpful. And why do I say that? Because what is always known is what's not counted doesn't count. So once you put some statistics and some facts, people are often more comfortable because they think there's a persuasive argument. And I'm now about to blow the argument out of the water, because the problem we have here is we're comparing apples and pears, or perhaps even orangutans and pineapples. Why do I say that? Because we are thinking about women's work, and it's really about whether women's work is valued, and we only value work which is paid. And this is a basic problem that we have, is not just only is women's work that which is paid, but actually, certainly in my experience, when we want to talk about the pension and the studies that I've done, women never stop work. It's interesting that women obviously do very well, or girls I might add, do very well at school. And then we have this drop off that Chris is referring to in later life, which of course we put down to the terribleness of being a woman, because they go around willy-nilly having children, having time off for their little holidays called maternity leave. They follow that on with a load of nonsense about having a family, and then they have the menopause. How very dare they? And then of course they're just crones, they're post any use for reproduction, so we can just let them sort of tend some care homes, perhaps do a little bit of charity work, and we'll forget all about them. And I don't intend to be that flippant, but the argument, unfortunately, is that strong. And if I refer to Penny Dick at University of Sheffield, if any of you met Penny, she'll very much talk about the problem that we've got here is we're not comparing like with like. We're not looking at male careers versus female careers. Now, I have a son, he's a lovely chap, who's very keen on Jordan Peterson. And so he spends much time arguing with my daughter about the whole issue on the pay gap. And you may be very familiar with Jordan Peterson. And actually, I quite like him because he's a psychologist, and I also am qualified in psychology. Having made that point, and he's very careful about the things he says, by the way, to make sure that he's not challenged too much. But the point really is that we are not looking at the bigger picture, and the bigger picture is actually about society. And so when we start to look at the gender pay gap, that's a very small polarization of the issue. But for companies, it's an issue that's becoming bigger in the same way as 20 years ago when I used to teach environmental economics, companies used to ignore the environment. Now they're actually pilloried for ignoring it. And the same is true now on gender pay gap. But the bigger issue is actually about the role of women within society. Sorry, Chris, I didn't do it to launch in.
No, it's an absolutely brilliant point, and I'll just follow up if that's all right on that one.
Please do.
One of the other things to recognise is a lot of that unpaid work in the house, not just childcare, but all sorts of emotional labour that's done in the household, a lot of the cleaning work, a lot of the cooking work, domestic labour that is unpaid. It actually means that the majority of women are working for much longer hours than men. There was a wonderful study called The Timeline by Arlie Hochschild, the American sociologist, who looked at this, and she referred to women having to work the second shift when they got home, and the work that they would have to do keeping the house and the family going. And she suggested, in fact, that women were working significantly longer hours, and she was looking at executive managerial employees, and the women would be working almost 50% as hard in terms of the number of hours they were putting in as men. It's just that a large proportion of those hours were unpaid work at home, often, in fact, actually protecting the spaces that allowed the men to do the evening shifts, to do the extra work and the overtime when it was to employee management couples. So that's, of course, that's a part of that. It might be outside the control of employees, but it's going to be interesting to those of us who are chartered managers and are in those kinds of positions, because it partly explains why we have those unequal career outcomes.
I would also add to that, because obviously we've kind of hinted around the issues around family, but one of the big issues that comes out when we start to look at age is who's looking after the grandparents, and where grandparents were, when we look at the later years that we're now working, so 67 in the UK, potentially 70, that has the problem with who's looking after the children if the grandparents are working. So it becomes a societal shift, and that's really what I was trying to make the point, is that we're probably using a 1970s model to consider 2022. Also it's about societal expectations, and I don't want to take away from single male parenting, or even where we've got same-sex male parenting, because they obviously are challenged in a similar way, because the real issues are somewhere between work-family conflict and the nature of society and how jobs are paid or unpaid, and I include volunteers within that.
Excellent. Thank you for addressing that question. I think we've mentioned the next item, which is sort of about menopause and how menopause impacts the workplace. So we are starting to see more awareness around menopause and the impact in the workplace. Diane, how has this changed over the last few years?
I think I'd like to tell you a little story. This probably won't surprise you on this front. A few years ago, we were running a research institute thinking about aging, and there was a professor came over from Australia, and this probably tells you how the Australians are a little bit ahead of us. His name is Geoffrey Grierson, and I'd like his name to be recognised as he brought across information about the Latrobe Project. And the Latrobe Project was a project which was done in Australia thinking about this. This was absolutely unthought of in the UK. Now, I want to make it clear, there was lots thought about the menopause. Clinically, the menopause and in the medical profession has been long since around, even in my grandmother's day. And that was a few weeks ago. That was something that was still considered a mysterious thing that women went through, but it was very much a clinical issue that they were aware of. But actually, only a few years ago did it become an issue within the UK in the period of work. And it's quite a funny thing, quite coincidence. Somebody called Joe Brewis over at the University of Leicester, and we come from the same stable, so I come from the University of Leicester stable, and it was sheer chance, happened to be asked about the menopause side of things at the same time as Geoffrey had brought this project over, and we both started writing, but in different institutions in the same way. Now, we both did something which was a structured literature review, was to look at what was going on in terms of the literature around the world of work and the menopause. Unfortunately, within the Anglia University, I actually didn't continue that after we actually, with somebody called Kath Rydausch, who actually presented papers to the CIPD nationally in terms of this particular subject. But fortunately, Joe Brewis, who's now at the Open University with me, and also other colleagues who went on at Leicester, took up a project, particularly with the TUC, and actually then unveiled some of this. This is to my amusement, because now in the good old days of University of Suffolk, where I'm asked to come and have a chat with the menopause working group, which didn't exist X number of years ago when we had this, and they ask me my opinions on these matters. And this tells us that really in a very short period of time, it's gone from being something that you just didn't say to something which people think they should have a working group on. I also had a period of time where I actually was interviewed by people like BBC Essex and also other national stations, asking me about this peculiar thing, thinking that we should have common tips for everybody. What is it like to be a woman having the menopause? Everybody would have a universal experience. And I could just say to employers, here's 10 top tips for your employees. Patronising, I think, at the very least. Shall I put it this way? And I think that what we see now is actually a greater understanding, because there is a simple numbers game going on, and that is actually about age. We are seeing an aging female workforce. And so when I was having this conversation a few years back, that was just the tip of the iceberg. Today, we are seeing a generation going through where there are an awful lot of workers who are post 50. And this might really surprise some people. You know, some of them are much younger than that to experience the menopause. And then we've even heard of something called the perimenopause, which means you don't actually have to be an aging crone to have gone through the menopause. But we'd also add that there are women who go through the menopause who have nothing to do with age. And in fact, the most tragic case I'm aware of is a 4-year-old. So when we start to look at the menopause, this awareness raising, this is the word that was women's troubles. This is the word that my grandmother and my mother didn't want to talk about. This is the word that Joe Brewis says we should say: menopause, menopause, menopause. And what was embarrassing about maternity 30 or 40 years ago, now we wouldn't consider an issue. And we have to remember, partly this is to do with the changing nature of work and the numbers of women in the workplace. But now this is probably a matter for age. And so that was the reason for telling you that story. How have things changed? Actually, it does feel glacial change that we're talking about in terms of pay that Chris refers to. But actually, perhaps in the menopause, something which was a dirty secret is something that is discussed. And I know we've got other questions sort of around that, but they all have implications in terms of how we view the next few minutes in this argument or discussion.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. So I guess, is there anything you wanted to add to that, Chris, or would you like to move on to the next? Should we move on to the next one?
No, I will if that's okay, just very quickly. I do think it is improving, and it's interesting. I mean, Diane's just mentioned the work of Professor Brewis at the Open University, and she has actually quite, readily recognised recently that this is at least one area where the UK is in the vanguard of developing positive approaches to dealing with the menopause. The fact that we're here discussing this now at the CMI, the fact that we've seen reports published by the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development as well, that we've had several government reports, and I think a lot of that can actually be traced back to the Government Equalities Office report that Jo Brewis and some of her colleagues worked on in 2017, which has really made a big difference. And coincidentally, coming in at 2017, the same time as the compulsory pay gap reporting. So I think we are starting to see some positive moves there, but it is really interesting that this is a phenomenon that affects 50% of the working population, right? Half of the population is women. They will be impacted on this at some point, and that perimenopausal period can go from sort of well, I mean, of course, as Diane said, it can hit irregular ages, but the average is around sort of 45 to 55 period where that's mostly starting to have those impacts. So it's the time when people are earning significantly, and we are still seeing data that suggests about 23% of women are actually who have really strong symptoms that actually impact on their working life, and they choose to reduce their working hours, with up to 11% of women affected actually leaving the workplace entirely. Now, in the context of an aging population in the UK, these are people who are at the prime of their careers. In many cases, they'll have a wealth of experience, and we're losing really valuable people from the workplace. And I think that's a challenge that we still haven't fully addressed. And it's worth comparing that to something like our awareness about maternity, with maternity leave, those kinds of conditions, that is openly discussed in a way that I think the menopause still isn't openly discussed in the same way, with clear policies being published for organisations. And yet fewer people become mothers, then we'll go through menopause. So it really should be something that's much higher on our agenda, even if we are making good progress.
And I couldn't agree with you more, Chris, and that's really helpful feedback in terms of the extra points there, because again, the issues are actually, when I go back to Penny Dix, the nature of women's work, insofar as the experience is not the same as men. And that's not to say that we don't yet know much about the male menopause. There may be issues. And certainly when we look at aging, there are issues. But some of the research that I did in the aging capacity focused on women simply because the nature of women's work from the moment that they reach puberty and onwards is affected by their position in terms of hormones, and that's different to the male experience. And the problem here we really get back to is perhaps, just as I used to get my students to watch on the buses videos of how we treated bus clippies historically in comedy in the UK, in reality, it is a changing nature of work, and it's arguably a celebration that we are living longer in that same sense. But there are real issues about the nature of female work, and looking at it around the world, Chris is quite right to highlight that actually in the UK, it's not all dire by any means, as we compare it to some other countries. But it's certainly something that the recognition of the difference between female work and male work is perhaps still not really thought through.
We've also sort of, I guess, something as well that compounds this is we've had news recently, we see sort of various menopause campaigners talking about the scarcity at the moment of HRT as well. So even women who are obtaining
absolutely
that and trying to make get access for all to HRT to help mitigate the hormonal change.
But I think an important point, actually, Chris was raising this, and I thought about it at the time, is the underreporting of this. The idea that 11% leave. We have to remember, and it comes up later on in employment law. Actually, this is an area that people are ashamed of. This is an area where people don't want to admit failure. They don't want to have a highlighted point. So there's probably a good deal more people who actually make decisions about their commitment to their employment based on this. And also, there's still very little known about postmenopause. You know, this idea that again, this is somebody called Professor Nancy Harding, who's now down at Bath, who's done the Crohn studies, which are those people who are postmenopause. And the reason is because in our discourse about work, even though we imagine we're going to 67, we can't possibly imagine how aging these people must be and what terrible employees they must be if they're even postmenopausal. And so there is actually very little known about how long the menopause truly lasts, how many people are truly affected, what the symptoms are. So Chris talks about the symptoms being extreme, but again, it's very, very much underreported. You know, when we're talking about extreme, it's kind of like those people who've almost had their leg cut off by you know, the work that they're doing. They really can't do it because they're in a situation that it's that impairing. But actually, many of the women, I laugh because I'll hold myself up to be one of these Crohn's postmenopause, and I listen to friends of mine who talk to me about their terrible symptoms, but I can guarantee almost 100% of them never report it to anybody. Sorry.
So working with incomplete data as well, aren't we, really? So
that's my first point, and that data gets more complicated when we start talking about the pandemic. But Chris made some very important points earlier about different sectors, because we shouldn't assume that it's an even playing field, even from sector viewpoint.
So you mentioned the pandemic, Diane. So let's move on to the next question, which is, what changes to work have been brought about by COVID and the pandemic, and how have these impacted the gender pay and pension gap, and also people dealing with menopause?
Well, of course, the CMI is already aware of this because you've got a workshop on the Great Resignation. And the real questions is where's the research on what is the real cause of the Great Resignation? But if I go back to the research that Kath Rydalsh and I did, which we took to the CIPD, what you see is this issue about low pay in what is low valued work. And then we look at the nature of those people who originally could historically work from home. Chris and I are in the lofty world, along with Sarah, of being academics who honestly just lay about all day long anyway, working from home. But we are run into the situation. Chris is looking at me. It's not true at all, by the way, for anybody who thought that. The reality is this idea of hybrid working is the way forward of the future is actually being undermined currently by the government wanting 70% of people back in the workplace. And we are also grappling with this idea that one of the problems we've got at the moment in COVID is this problem of people not being at work. Now, it may be that this particular phenomena is going to disappear very quickly. It could be by the time we get to the summer, there aren't people who are not attending things because they're unwell through COVID. It may be that actually hybrid working is actually no surprise to us because it's something that's nearly all of my academic career we've talked about truly flexible work. And again, we're in the middle of an information technology revolution. How bizarre it is that we think that the only way work can happen is in the workplace. And when we look at work-family conflict, when we look at the issues for people who may be experiencing a difference in the way that they want to work through the periods of their career, which might be known as aging, we have actually very, very simple answers to all of this. And I think the best way we can think about this is if we have a look at 2000, I imagined myself that I would be looking at Nirvana by now when we were looking at things like high performance working. But what we found by 2010, if we look at the work of people like Hassard, is long hours working. And even myself, we're reporting by 2015 the sheer pressures of the nature of work. So how much of the Great Resignation is to do with the fact that people don't want to work in the way that they did before COVID? How much did COVID make them think, why am I doing this? Why am I doing it in this way? Is the money that I make really worth this? And then we get to those people who may be going through the menopause, whose symptoms are quite problematic, who are fearful of reporting it. And they say to themselves, well, why am I doing this? Maybe I could do something else. And I was smiled because I used to remember my grandmother used to be sitting at home in our house stringing beans. And I was supposed to look back at her and feel sorry for her because she didn't have the pleasures that I had for full-time work. She didn't have the pleasures of a long hours career. And often I've been jealous of my grandmother sitting there stringing beans. And I think that perhaps again tells us something about what COVID is really doing for us, is getting us to think about what do we want these careers to look like? And those people who can make choices are changing their choices. And those people may well be women who are going through the menopause.
Okay, thank you. Chris, do you have something you wanted to add on in terms of this, and what have you experienced and witnessed?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing is we don't yet know what the final experiment will look like. We don't know how this the Great Resignation is going to play out, what the long-term consequences of that will be. But what I do think we are likely to see, based on previous studies of inequality in home workers, is that people who work from home are less visible in the workplace and are less likely to be promoted. Now, I talked earlier about the horizontal segregation between, for example, two different professions and the different pay gap that can emerge from that. The other cause of the pay gap is vertical segregation. So men being concentrated in the higher earning positions within a particular career. If women are spending more of the time, and we saw this during COVID, having to deal with the childcare, having to deal with the sick care, having to deal with the sick days at home, disproportionately picking up some of that workload, they're going to be less visible in the office. And if managers aren't very mindful of this and don't have very clear processes for actually evaluating the concrete work that is being done by people and their actual performance, rather than the surrogates that often happen, particularly in knowledge professions, of presenteeism counting as if it was effective working, then we will start to see people who are able to be present in the office being disproportionately rewarded with promotions and career progression, which will actually potentially reverse the gains that we've made. So I think that's a genuine risk if, as managers, we are not very careful to have very good promotions and appraisal processes in place that can account for that.
I think that's a really good segue into our sort of the final question that we wanted to talk about, and that's the future of work. So obviously we're talking about how do we reconsider the appraisal and the performance mechanisms. But so what do you see the future of work looking like, and how do you think this is going to impact equality and diversity? So Chris.
No, it's a really interesting scenario. Obviously, you know, I don't have my crystal ball here, so I can't actually predict what the future of work will look like. And you know, I think trying to predict that what the future is always one of those areas where academics will fall down, because we just don't know. Unexpected, unintended consequences tend to characterize the reality of social change. But based on what we do know at the moment, I've just mentioned, I think the increase in home working is likely to impact. I think we are starting to see as well, partly because companies in the recent COVID situation have been able to see they've got expensive empty office spaces that are perhaps underutilized and are moving away from those office spaces. We're seeing a rise of open plan, agile working spaces. Those can encourage people to be working from home, so they might be less present and visible. I think if we look at how that's going to impact on things like the menopause, it's a lot more difficult to control your environment in an open plan office where you don't have anywhere to store a fan. They perhaps don't have the same sort of working spaces and conditions. There isn't anywhere where a lot of the kind of reasonable adjustments that can be made to compensate for the symptoms of menopause and how it affects the workplace are harder to do in those kinds of environments. So I think that's another potential risk. I don't want to be all negative about it, but I guess the third one is drawing on my own research, looking at the craft brewing industry. This is a really interesting sector because skill is something that really comes out in this. And traditionally, the most skilled professions, the most highly paid ones, were the ones that had socially achieved skills through being accredited, going through an apprenticeship, going through a degree, getting a particular set of educational achievements or apprenticeship guild achievements guaranteed by a trade union that counted as skills. So if you were in a skilled profession, you were part of a union and you could protect those skills. What we've started to see with the move towards the service sector, rise of hospitality industries, those kinds of things, is that skill is less likely to be something that is achieved and more likely to be something that's ascribed, something that people will recognize as an employer. So when I've been looking at the difference in pay, for example, between bar staff, somebody who works in a fancy hipster craft beer bar outlet and can talk about 20 different types of hops, the different yeast fermentation processes, and can do all of this and sell the high priced beers, will earn significantly more than somebody who is just serving a regular pint of beer from a standard dispenser. So, but it's because they've got particular sets of skills that they're able to persuade their employer that they are worth more money. And I think in those kinds of cases, we start to see a breakdown of a traditional stranglehold that male-dominated professions had over what counts as skill. But the question remains as to who will actually be in a position to claim what counts as skillful work. And there is a wonderful study, and I do have to cite this one because the authors are called Guy and Newman from the early 2000s, which I think is perfect for somebody studying sort of gender inequality in the workplace. And they looked at things like the gender pay gap and the different skills relationship. And they looked at technicians who were doing assessments in a fruit and vegetable market. And they compared those to people who were actually doing sort of social family service counselors. Now, the pay gap didn't exist between them. They earned the same. The fruit market inspectors were all men. 80% of the family service counselors were women. There was equal pay for those two things, but to be a family service counsellor required a university degree and a professional certification, whereas there were no qualifications at all required for the fruit market inspector. One counted as more skills, and the argument that Guy and Newman put forward for that is that much of the work for family service counsellors counted as being unskilled because it was what women do naturally anyway. Oh, well, they're naturally potentially mothers, they're caring, these are nurturing facilities. So it wasn't recognized as skillful, even though it required a degree. So there's something there about how skill gets mobilized, justified in the marketplace as something that deserves higher pay, and inequality that can stem from that misrecognition of skill as something that perhaps just doesn't count as being skillful. So I think those are really interesting things that will be played out in the future, particularly through this emergence of what we call the neo-craft or neo-artisanal industries.
Thanks, Chris. So Diane, have you got anything to add? And then we'll
I think Chris is beginning to highlight some of the wider issues here. So skill is, of course, a very important feature of this. And when we start to look at the gender pay gap, this is really why I'll quote Anne Widdecombe, who says, you know, if you're a politician, you're a good politician. It makes no difference whether you're a man or a woman. I've never seen a problem. And why do I say that? Why did I use that? Well, because there are an awful lot of other issues. And this intersectionality, CIPD reporting this last month that if you happen to be of an ethnic minority, you're likely to be paid 13% less than a white worker. Now, that we haven't got time to unpack today, but if you were a woman from an ethnic minority, and we start to get into some of the conversations that we historically had about equality of opportunity. We've also got to think about, and I mentioned the information technology revolution, because it's about what do you do with humans? When do you pay them? When do you employ them? When do you not bother with them? So when we talk about low skills, they're not paid enough to worry about making them redundant. And in fact, many of our vacancies today, and I've got one company I work with who tell me they've got 11,000 vacancies currently in the southeast because their pay is at minimum wage. And they cannot get enough employees. Now, I'm not going to go any further on who you might think those employees might be, but that's an indication of something which is fairly phenomenal. If we then start to think a little bit more widely on these topics and we look at the higher end of skill, then we can't get a computer to do what the higher end can do. And so there are personal services in particular which involve considerable abilities, and Chris is kind of talking about this with the craft to some degree, which may be knowledge which is acquired in a variety of ways, which we will continue to use because it's not worth developing the level of technology that we would need to be able to replace these people. So in the middle, we've got a bunch of people who might be able to be replaced by artificial intelligence. And the question really is this going to see a shake-up of our jobs? And we can see this with COVID. We see this in retail. We see those companies who took advantage of digital services and home delivery being very sharply changed by those people who simply had to be closed down. And we will see that change because we will also see that people don't always want to have a digital service. Maybe they want a personal service and they want retailers who actually are able to offer them an experience. So when we start to think about this nature of work in the future and equality and diversity, in some ways I might be describing a dystopia for very many people, because the real questions are if you are vulnerable, if you like, by being either too cheap or too old or in some way not able to benefit from future employment, we may see major issues which are societal. And I think that's really getting me to the point about women's work really is. It's about what we want as a society rather than short-term issues of the marketplace.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks for your feedback on that. So, Sarah, we'll hand over to you for some additional pre-submitted questions.
Yeah, so I have some questions that I wanted to ask, but I really want to actually just get some from the chat, actually, because I'm conscious of the time. I don't want to miss out what people have been keen to ask in the chat, and we had a few that have been submitted prior to the event as well. So I think I'm going to jump straight in with the chat ones first, or if that's okay with everybody. So we had a really good question here about how would a company actually encourage failure and learning to start with? So trying to address some of these issues, and how can a company encourage more empathy in the workspace? So yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know if Diane, do you want to start off on that one, maybe?
I was going to suggest Chris because I know he's very empathetic, and I don't mean that in an awful way. I have worked with Chris before. The issue about empathy is a simple word, isn't it? It's a simple word that's kind of put by nice people about being nice in a nice workplace. And the reality is we're really talking about understanding, and it's probably more about ignorance as a intentional unkindness. We are aware that we have gone through a period of very macho capitalist forces within the workplace. There's very few small businesses who would make some of the foolish mistakes of some of the large businesses in the way they treat people, because they simply exist on the management of their people. And so when we want to talk about empathy, it's often actually somewhere between fear and people trying to position themselves within a business, and whether the company has got power structures which requires them to be very political. And I don't think we can unpack that question any more quickly than to say it's actually a very complex environment. And the words empathy is something that I hope we aspire to, but it's something that's not easy to achieve.
Yeah, thanks, Diane. Chris, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I'm not entirely sure that I understand the question about encouraging failure, or exactly what kind of failure was being thought about there. But in relation to the empathy, I think that is really important. And certainly when we're looking at some of the advice that has come out from, for example, the CIPD around supporting people through menopause, a lot of that is actually just good practice for managers. It's having open conversations, removing the taboos, recognizing those things, and not being anxious or nervous about talking openly. Diane suggested earlier, we should be talking about menopause all the time, because opening it up, having those open conversations, getting these things out into the public is really important. That's different from directly challenging somebody with, oh, are you going through the menopause now, and putting them on the spot where they might defend that. However, if you're worried about one of your employees, if you've got concerns about people, if they don't seem to be well, or you can see that they're suffering in certain ways, or their performance has been impacted, having an open conversation, are you okay? How are things in this space? Having that empathetic, open discussion and creating a space where people can talk about things, I think is really important. In relation to empathy as well, I think it is important to recognize that we don't want to single people out. There is still a taboo, for example, around menopause, and we should be careful about how we approach those kinds of topics. And again, I'm taking this from some of Jo's work and the reports that she's done to the UK government and to various other bodies. But she singled out as a particularly good example, for example, having breathable uniforms made with natural fibres that will allow greater temperature regulation. But what you don't want to do if you're providing those is have them become a kind of a menopause uniform where it's singling people out and putting them into a special category that makes things visible. So one way that the Manchester Police Service, for example, who are considered as a great example for this, did that was they put out a breathable uniform and said, this is great if you're cycling to work or if you're involved in high energy activities when you're out on the beat. Anybody could come along and get that, anybody could do that, but it also solved the fundamental problem that if you're having difficulty with temperature regulation, non-breathable, really heavy uniforms can actually be quite difficult and were affecting women's performance. So that kind of really empathetic, sensitive, but not singling people out approach, I think is something that's really important. But it's also what I would hope good managers, and certainly any certified managers from the CMI, would already be doing in the kind of conversations they're having with employees.
Yeah, that's a really nice example. Thanks, Chris. Another question we had come in from Victoria was saying, with the gap in age to draw a state pension reducing, how is it justified, do you think it will ever be reversed to acknowledge the life events of women? So any thoughts on that?
I mean, again, this is one of the things when I was talking about women's work. So we know that there will be periods of time that the majority of women who have any family commitments are going to be affected in the way that they attend work. So this will have an impact in terms of their pension pot, and it will equally have an impact in terms of how long they're expected to work, etc. So this does present us with the problem of how do we deal with that as a country. And the reality is I'm afraid to be political and say it's in the ballot box. If people want to have this changed, it will be changed. As a country, we have one of the highest retirement ages. As a country, we haven't paid much attention to this. And as a country, if we want to make it changed, then we need to do something about it, which is political. I won't get into the political system because I'm sure you appreciate that's some of the issues.
Yeah, I would agree completely with Dan. It's basically a political question. It depends whether there is that political will. But I do think it's an important question, and how we frame this is really important. And it comes back to some points Diana made earlier about equality and what counts as equality. One of the reasons that the pensions age has been increased is, well, of course, affordability and government finances, but it's also about equalizing the retirement age. But if we take the point that Diane made earlier about women already working longer hours, doing a lot of unpaid work, they've already done more work when they get to the retirement age. So equality shouldn't necessarily be the same, having exactly the same thing that's applied to men and women. It might also be a reduced pensionable age and a reduced retirement age, recognizing that there's more work being done for the social good during the life course of that. Now, that one way would be to recognise that inequality. The other would be to start to redistribute some of that domestic labour in the first place, so that it's not necessary to do that kind of work. But those are broad, interesting political, but also cultural and social phenomena that would need to see really quite profound change, both in our domestic division of labour as well as within the workplace and politics formally.
Super. Thank you. Another question that we had that was submitted in advance from Stephen was coming through. So can you share any remuneration methods that might help attract and retain staff? And we're thinking about this in terms of how those methods might actually help address that pay gap. Any advice?
Well, if I just start, one of the issues is that, you know, in HR as a profession, they spend a lot of time worrying about reward, and the issue or the crux of the pay gap is actually about equality and fairness over time. Charles Handy actually even wrote a book about how we might rechange the way we think about our whole time within society, and as an inside-out society, in terms of thinking about our life in pay, if you like. That would be a very socialist model, if you like, even though I don't think we'd accuse Charles Handy of necessarily being categorized in that way. And I think these are the issues, is how do you actually do this? And Jordan Peterson, as I said, may be popular in certain fields, but he really tries to make the points that this is really difficult to how you actually get your pay right, to take into account all the issues and still actually attract people. So I think what this is really, it may sound like I'm ducking the question, but the real issue is we need to have a conversation, and the conversation shouldn't just be my voice. And it needs to have the need from the business sector to say, look, this is a real problem that we really want to address, because, as Chris mentioned earlier, we are losing talent. And as a country, because my background's labour market, we have put money into education for women of maybe 11 years in compulsory education, which we then fritter away over issues that we can't deal with because we rely on market-based policies. And so something that, if it has a societal impact in both the pension and has a societal impact in terms of families, and it has a societal impact in terms of the current poverty issues that we're aware of with the changing economy, then it's something that the society needs to start thinking about, rather than relying upon this being left at the HR manager talking to an individual board, trying to set individual remuneration packages.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I suppose links that question, we had one coming from Jessie saying, what's your opinion on publishing salary bands for all employees to see? Does that help or hinder? Any thoughts on that?
Well, all the unions, of course, would say absolutely you should do this. Chris?
Yeah, I would actually agree for what it's worth, Dan, in this case with the unions, absolutely. If you look at places like Sweden, for example, where actually pay is published, then, you know, there is transparency. If you can see what other people are earning, actually, this does come back very nicely to Stephen's point. If people are very visible about who's earning what, and it's not a dirty secret whose pay is what, then it's really straightforward to enter into a negotiation. It makes visible who's earning what, and you can see that kind of parity. We know from basic organizational psychology that, of course, pay is important, but it's not just important because the gas price is rising. It's also important because it's a status indicator. It's something we use to compare ourselves with our peers in the workplace. So having something that doesn't create that anxiety and that stress and that worry that you're being underpaid or that somebody's being overpaid, and keeping all that secret, bringing it out into the open would allow a possibility to have open discussions about who's actually doing fair work and being remunerated fairly for it. And I think that would have a massive impact on the pay gap, but it would also really help to retain those critical people who we know are leaving the workplace in their 50s, at the prime of their knowledge base. They've got all of the experience of not just their formal education, as Dan was talking about earlier, but their experiences in the workplace, their understandings of management practices, often at a particular level. But if they're leaving the workplace because they're feeling under-rewarded, unrecognized, if they're not supported in dealing with difficult symptoms of menopause for a period of time, not for the rest of a working life, then we're really losing some of the most talented people that we need to recruit and retain if we want to see sustainable economic futures for everybody.
But if I can just add to that last bit, Chris, just very quickly, part of the problem is because we have a sudden death approach to age. Once you retire, that's it. Now, that's changing. But it's not always changing for the right reasons. And that goes back to my point about thinking about work in its entirety, rather than this idea, oh, well, you're, by the way, in law, you're old at 41. That's when we changed the rules about redundancy. Rather than the ideas we no longer have the statutory retirement age, but rather than saying, oh, you're looking a bit grey now, we ought to be popping you off quickly. Many of the people who are fed up with work who are leaving are thinking that there's going to be a better life once they've actually left. And in fact, what's really interesting when we look at retirement studies is that actually you are more likely, the earlier that you leave work, the more likely you are to die. And also when we start to get into comorbidities. So we want to talk about positive aging and longer life, and that's not a hint for my book, by the way. The reality is that work which is actually meaningful, fair, and done in a way that actually embraces our lives as humans is going to perpetuate the better societal issues of later life. So the issues about the costs of care homes and so forth can actually be impacted by this. And even in terms of exercise within the workplace. So sorry, it was intended to be a quick point, but it's really just saying our problems is that we're probably trying to tinker with something which is actually based in male and female issues, when actually we should be looking at the whole of the nature of work.
That's great. I think that's a really excellent point to leave it on, actually. And thank you for a great discussion, both Diane and Chris. So I'm going to bring Natasha back in now to wrap us up.
Thank you very much. So yes, that is it for today's session. We have had lots of comments about how much people have enjoyed this, and that we could just listen to the panel of you go on for a long time, which I would love to listen to as well. But thank you to everyone who joined us, and thank you to Catherine and Sarah, our hosts, and to Professor Chris and Dr. Diane, our speakers, for your insights and expertise. Don't forget, if you're a member of CMI, you can log into Management Direct using the link in the live chat, and you can find a wide range of exclusive and practical development resources and much more. And if you're not yet a member or subscriber, you can join our community via the link that's also in the live chat to gain full access to our Management Direct portal. You can also sign up to the free CMI newsletter for the latest trends and tips for managers and leaders. Please do take a few moments to let us know your thoughts on today's event by completing the evaluation form. And thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.